Okay, so you know that feeling when you see all your neighbors getting ready for some kind of disaster, like
Yeah.
boarding up their windows for a hurricane or,
Right.
maybe stocking up on supplies because there's a blizzard coming.
Hmm.
And you're kind of standing there thinking, really? Come on. Is it really going to be that bad?
Yeah.
But then there's that little voice in the back of your head like, well, maybe I should be doing something.
Yeah, you don't want to be caught off guard.
Exactly. It's that tension between what we think is going to happen and what we see our neighbors doing that we're going to dive into today.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how our relationships with our neighbors can actually influence our choices,
Hmm.
especially when it comes to these big, scary events that we try to convince ourselves won't happen to us.
Yeah, like, oh, that'll never happen here.
Right, exactly. So specifically, we're looking at some research today on flood mitigation in southeast Queensland, Australia.
Okay, so an area that's definitely prone to flooding.
Very much so. But where people often don't take enough precautions?
So this isn't just about general neighborly influence, like, oh, my neighbor has a nice car, so maybe I should get one too.
Right.
It's specifically how those relationships affect our decisions about protecting ourselves.
Exactly. And what's really cool about this research is that for the first time, we have a model that shows exactly how these social dynamics play out.
Ooh, a model now. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, think of it like a map. But instead of streets and roads, we're mapping the connections between people and how those connections can lead to action or inaction when it comes to preparing for a flood.
Okay, I'm hooked. Yeah. I definitely want to hear more about this model. But first, I know you were particularly interested in the three main protective actions that they studied: flood insurance, raising your house, and making home improvements.
Hmm.
So why are those the smart choices when it comes to mitigating flood risk?
Well, flood insurance is pretty straightforward. It helps you financially recover if your home is damaged by flooding. Raising your house, that's literally lifting the whole structure to a higher level. So you're putting it above potential floodwaters.
Makes sense.
And home improvements are things like waterproofing your basement or installing flood-resistant materials. So basically making your house tougher and able to withstand flood damage.
Okay, so all very practical steps that people can take.
Exactly.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The study found that it's not just about knowing a lot of neighbors who took those actions. What really mattered was feeling close to those neighbors. Like having that neighbor you can chat with over the fence, borrow a cup of sugar from.
Yeah, that kind of closeness.
Exactly.
And to really illustrate this, let's dive into some data from their insurance model. They found that if you felt close to just one neighbor who had flood insurance, you were 10% more likely to also have insurance.
Okay, interesting.
But if you felt close to three neighbors with insurance, your likelihood jumped to 30%.
Wow, that's a pretty big jump.
Huge difference, right?
Yeah, so it seems like it's not just about knowing someone took action, it's about having a real connection with them.
Absolutely.
So why do you think that closeness is so important?
Well, it all comes down to trust and how we perceive risk. Think about it. You're bombarded with information constantly from experts in the news, social media. But when it comes to something as personal as protecting your home, you're much more likely to trust someone you have a genuine relationship with, someone who understands your specific context and your concerns.
So it's like hearing about flood risks from some distant expert is one thing, but having your neighbor tell you about their own experience with flooding, that hits differently.
Exactly. That personal connection can make the risk feel much more real, more urgent.
Yeah, like suddenly it's not just some abstract threat, it's something that could actually happen to you.
Right. And that brings us to the idea of social amplification of risk, which is basically how those personal conversations within a network can make a threat feel much more real and urgent.
So it's like that feeling when you see your neighbor boarding up their windows for a hurricane. Suddenly it doesn't seem so far-fetched that you might need to do the same.
Exactly. Our neighbors' actions can really serve as a wake-up call.
Okay, so closeness is a big factor. But what about the house raising model? Did closeness play the same role there?
Yes, but there's an interesting twist. In that model, they found that both closeness and ND, the perceived effectiveness of the neighbor's actions, mattered. So let's say your neighbor raised their house and you thought, wow, that seems like a really smart move. It actually worked for them. You'd be more likely to consider doing the same yourself.
But only if you felt close to that neighbor, right? It's not just about seeing some random person's house on stilts.
Exactly. It's like we're constantly evaluating the information we receive from our neighbors. We're not just blindly following the crowd. We're thinking, does this make sense for me? Did it work for someone I trust?
So it's a much more nuanced process than just monkey see, monkey do, We're actually using our social connections to gather information weigh options and then make informed decisions.
Exactly. And that brings up this fascinating concept called network paradoxes.
Okay, network paradoxes.
Okay.
What's that all about?
So while our close ties undeniably influence us, relying too heavily on a single network can sometimes limit our information and our ability to adapt.
See what you mean.
Imagine a close-knit group of friends who all get their news from the same source. They might miss out on crucial information or alternative perspectives.
So it's like being stuck in an echo chamber.
Exactly.
You're surrounded by people who all think the same way, so you might miss out on the bigger picture.
Right. That's why having diverse networks and being open to information from various sources is so important. It allows us to make more informed decisions, especially when it comes to something as crucial as preparing for a potential disaster.
All right, so we've talked about insurance and house raising. What about home improvements? Did they find anything different there?
This is where it gets even more interesting. For home improvements, they found that the number of neighbors taking action also mattered, alongside closeness. So in this case, it wasn't enough to just have one or two close friends who had made improvements. Seeing a larger number of people in your neighborhood doing it had a much stronger influence on your own choices.
That's very curious, but why do you think this particular action might be more sensitive to what many people are doing, as opposed to just a few close friends?
Well, think about it this way. If you see everyone on your street installing flood-resistant doors, you're more likely to feel like it's the expected behavior, even if it's not mandated. It's like a social norm emerges from the collective action of the community.
It's like, oh, everyone's doing it, so I should too.
Exactly. We humans are inherently social creatures. We look to our surroundings for cues about how to behave, and our neighbors are a powerful source of those cues, especially when we're dealing with something as uncertain as a potential disaster.
Okay, so what we're learning here is that our relationships with our neighbors actually influence our choices about preparing for these scary but hopefully unlikely disasters. And it's not just about knowing a bunch of people who took action. It's about the quality of those relationships and the specific actions themselves.
Exactly. It's a complex interplay of factors. But understanding those factors can give us valuable insights into how we can encourage people to take those steps to protect themselves and their communities.
That's a perfect place to wrap up this first part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground already, but there's so much more to explore in this fascinating research. So stay tuned, because we'll be back in just a moment to dive even deeper into the strategies and insights that can help us all create a safer, more resilient future.
You know, one of the things that really struck me about this research is how it kind of reframes our understanding of resilience. We often think of resilience in terms of physical infrastructure, like seawalls, levees, early warning systems.
Right, the stuff you can actually see.
Exactly. But this research is highlighting the importance of social infrastructure.
Wait, hold on. Social infrastructure. What exactly does that mean?
That's a great question. Think of it as like the networks of trust and shared responsibility that help communities withstand shocks. It's about having strong social connections, open communication channels, a sense of collective purpose.
Okay, so we're talking about a whole different kind of safety net here. One that's woven from relationships instead of steel and concrete.
Exactly.
That's a pretty powerful concept.
It really is. And you know what's amazing? That kind of safety net can be incredibly resilient. Think about how communities rally together after a disaster, people helping each other, sharing resources, working together to rebuild.
Yeah, you see that time and time again. It's inspiring to see how people come together in times of crisis, even when they've lost so much.
Absolutely. And this research is giving us a framework for how we can actually foster that spirit of cooperation before disaster strikes.
So instead of just reacting to a crisis,
Right.
we're trying to build up that social resilience beforehand, like strengthening the foundation of a house before a storm hits.
Exactly. And that's where those policy entrepreneurs we talked about earlier come in.
Right, the folks who can help translate these research findings into real-world action.
Precisely. They can act as catalysts, bringing people together, sharing knowledge, mobilizing resources to make their communities more prepared.
So they're like the bridge between the academic world and everyday life,
Exactly.
helping to turn those great ideas into practical solutions.
You got it.
But let's be honest, even with the best social infrastructure in the world, those black swan events, those totally unexpected disasters, they can still be terrifying.
Oh, absolutely.
How do we even begin to prepare for the unknown.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And that's where this research offers some really valuable insights. It's not just about stockpiling supplies or having an evacuation plan. Those are important too. It's about fostering a culture of preparedness that's deeply embedded in the fabric of our communities.
Okay, so it's like making preparedness part of the community's DNA,
Exactly.
something that's just ingrained in how we think and act. But how do we actually DO that?
Well, it starts with recognizing that resilience isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Each community has its own unique strengths and vulnerabilities and social dynamics.
So we can't just copy and paste solutions from one place to another.
Right.
We need to tailor those solutions to the specific context.
Exactly. And that's where understanding the power of those social networks comes in. It's about identifying those key influencers, those trusted individuals who can act as conduits for information and mobilization.
It's like finding the pressure points within the network, those individuals who can really amplify the message and get people moving in the right direction.
Precisely. And those individuals might not always be the ones with official titles or positions of authority. They could be longtime residents, community leaders, or even just passionate individuals who have earned the trust of their neighbors.
So it's not just about top-down leadership. It's about recognizing that leadership can emerge from anywhere within the network.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important to foster a culture of inclusivity and participation, where everyone feels valued and empowered to contribute.
It's about recognizing that everyone has something to offer, some piece of knowledge or skill that can help build a more resilient community.
Exactly. Resilience is not a solo act. It's a symphony of individual efforts, all working in harmony to create a stronger, more resilient whole.
That's a beautiful image. It's like we're all part of this intricate web of connections, and each thread contributes to the strength of the whole tapestry.
You know, this conversation has been incredibly eye-opening for me. It's made me realize that we often overlook the power of those everyday relationships, the connections we have with our neighbors, friends, community members.
It's easy to get caught up in our own busy lives and forget that we're all part of this larger ecosystem, this intricate web of interdependence.
And this research reminds us that those connections aren't just nice to have. They're essential for our survival, especially in the face of uncertainty and potential disasters.
It's a powerful message, and it makes me think about how I can be more intentional, about nurturing those connections in my own life.
Me too. It's a reminder that building resilience isn't just about preparing for the worst-case scenario. It's about investing in those relationships that make life worth living, the connections that give us strength and support when we need it most.
And it's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more resilient future.
Absolutely. Every act of kindness, every gesture of support, every conversation we have with our neighbors, all of these seemingly small things can contribute to building a stronger, more connected community.
This is all so inspiring. But let's be realistic. Not everyone is going to be jumping up and down to attend a disaster preparedness workshop
Yeah.
or become a policy entrepreneur.
Right.
How do we reach those folks who might be hesitant or skeptical?
That's a great question, and it's something the researchers addressed in their paper. They emphasize the importance of framing disaster preparedness in a way that resonates with people's values and motivations.
Okay, so it's not just about bombarding people with facts and figures. We need to connect with them on an emotional level, make it personal and relevant to their lives.
Exactly, and one way to do that is to focus on the shared benefits of preparedness. It's not just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting your family, your friends, your community.
I see what you mean. It's about appealing to that sense of shared responsibility,
Yeah.
that desire to
Yeah.
take care of each other.
Precisely. And another important aspect is to highlight the positive impacts of preparedness. It's not just about avoiding negative outcomes, it's about creating a sense of security, peace of mind, even empowerment.
So it's about reframing preparedness as something that can actually enhance our lives, not just something we have to do out of obligation or fear.
Exactly. It's about making it clear that preparedness isn't about living in a constant state of anxiety, but rather about taking proactive steps to create a more secure and resilient future for ourselves and our loved ones.
That's a much more appealing message.
Yeah.
And it makes me realize that we need to be much more creative and thoughtful about how we communicate about disaster preparedness.
Absolutely. It's not just about shouting from the rooftops. It's about having those one-on-one conversations, sharing stories, building relationships that can inspire action.
And it's about celebrating the small victories, those incremental steps that people are taking to make their communities more resilient.
You know, one of the things that really excites me about this research is that it gives us a roadmap for moving beyond those traditional top-down approaches to disaster preparedness. It's about empowering individuals and communities to take ownership of their own resilience.
It's about recognizing that the solutions to these complex challenges often lie within the communities themselves, within those networks of relationships and shared experiences.
And it's about trusting people to be the agents of their own destiny, to come together and create a future that's safer, stronger, and more resilient for everyone.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation, and I'm sure our listeners are eager to hear more about the specific strategies and policy recommendations that can help us all build those resilient communities.
Absolutely. We've covered a lot of ground today, but we've only just scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in this fascinating research. Stay tuned because in our next segment, we'll be diving even deeper into the practical implications of these findings, the tools and strategies that can help us all create a more resilient future.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the power of social connections, and how they can influence our choices, especially when it comes to those big, scary events we try to push to the back of our minds.
Right, those it'll never happen to me kind of events.
Exactly. But let's get practical here. What can we actually do with this information?
Well, one of the most important takeaways from this research is that we need to move beyond those traditional top-down approaches to disaster preparedness.
Like the government issues a warning, people ignore it kind of thing.
Exactly. We need to think differently about how we engage communities and empower individuals to take action.
So instead of just telling people what to do, we need to find ways to involve them in the process, make them feel like they're part of the solution.
Exactly. And this research provides some really concrete strategies for doing just that. Remember those policy entrepreneurs we talked about? Well, one of the key recommendations is to identify and support these individuals within our communities.
Okay, refresh my memory. Who are these policy entrepreneurs again, and how can they help?
So these are individuals who are passionate about disaster preparedness, and they have a real knack for mobilizing others. They might be community leaders, business owners, teachers, even just really engaged neighbors.
Got it.
They're the folks who can take those broad policy recommendations and translate them into action at the local level.
So they're like the bridge between the experts and the everyday people, helping to connect the dots and make preparedness feel more relevant and relatable.
Exactly. And they can do this in so many ways, organizing workshops, starting conversations, sharing their own experiences, even just being a friendly face who can answer questions and calm fears. They're the ones who can really make a difference in shifting the culture towards greater preparedness.
It's like having a trusted friend or neighbor who can guide you through the process.
Yeah.
Someone who understands your concerns and speaks your language.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to recognize and support these individuals. Give them the resources and encouragement they need to succeed. Because when they thrive, their communities thrive too.
That's a great point. But it's not just about relying on these policy entrepreneurs, is it?
Right.
What about the rest of us? What role can everyday people play in building more resilient communities?
Well, one of the simplest yet most powerful things we can do is just talk to each other. Start conversations about disaster preparedness with our families, friends, and neighbors.
Okay.
Share information, ask questions, listen to each other's concerns.
So it's about making preparedness part of our everyday conversations,
Exactly.
not just something we think about when there's a hurricane looming on the horizon.
Right, because the more we talk about it, the less scary it becomes. And the more connected we feel to our community, the more likely we are to take action to protect ourselves and each other.
I love that idea. It's about building those bonds of trust and shared responsibility that create a stronger, more resilient community.
You got it. And there are so many creative ways to do this. Organize a potluck dinner and invite your neighbors to brainstorm preparedness ideas. Start a neighborhood watch group that also focuses on disaster preparedness. Create a community garden where people can share skills and resources.
I like it.
The possibilities are endless.
I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's not just about having a plan, it's about having a community.
You hit the nail on the head. Because at the end of the day, resilience is about people. It's about those connections we forge, the support we offer, and the shared commitment to creating a safer future for everyone.
And this research has given us so much to think about in terms of how we can nurture those connections and build that resilience, both individually and collectively.
Absolutely. We've learned that our relationships with our neighbors have a profound impact on our choices, especially when it comes to preparing for those low-probability, high-impact events that we tend to downplay.
Right. We've discovered that closeness matters. Feeling connected to those around us increases our likelihood of taking protective actions.
Exactly.
And we've explored the power of social influence. How seeing our neighbors take action can inspire us to do the same.
It's powerful stuff.
And we've delved into the exciting realm of policy entrepreneurs, those passionate individuals who can bridge the gap between research and reality, bringing communities together and igniting collective action.
Right. It's about empowering people.
And perhaps most importantly, we've been reminded that building resilience isn't just about surviving. It's about thriving. It's about creating communities where people feel safe, supported, and empowered to face whatever challenges may come their way.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with the final thought. Look around your neighborhood, your community. Who are the people you trust? Who are the natural leaders? Reach out to them, start a conversation. And let's work together to build a more resilient future for all of us.
Because when we come together, when we harness the power of those social connections, we can create a world where we're not just weathering the storms, but emerging from them stronger, more connected, and more resilient than ever before.